In the spring of 1796, in a West Virginia cave being mined for gunpowder, workers dug up 3 claws, roughly 8 inches long. The bones reached Thomas Jefferson, then vice president. He examined them, decided they came from a giant lion, and told America's leading scientific body the animal was probably still alive out west. That is where this list begins. That cave is in Appalachia, and it is not the strangest thing anyone has pulled out of the ground there. That artifact makes this list. So do 29 others. A 3,000-year-old fishing net still intact. 37 wooden boxes still holding Confederate dirt, exactly where the last shift dumped it in 1865. A cave ceiling in Alabama covered in figures 11 feet tall that no human eye has ever seen whole. Stick with us to the end, because number 1 is a set of words written on a cave ceiling in Cherokee, every character reversed, so they could be read from inside the rock. This channel goes deep on the objects and places most people drive straight past. Subscribe if that is your kind of thing. Today we are counting down 30 unexplainable artifacts found in Appalachian caves that don't make sense. Number 30. The torch date on the wall, signed in smoke. Start in the wooded limestone foothills of southern Tennessee outside Sweetwater at a cave system called Craighead Caverns. During the Civil War, Confederate soldiers mined it for saltpeter to make gunpowder. They left no ledger, no report, no inventory of any kind. What they left was a date burned onto the rock with a candle flame. Niter mining was miserable, unglamorous work, carried out by men who did not expect to be remembered for it. Writing on a cave wall with a candle cost nothing. No tools, no ink. Hold the flame close, drag it, walk out. The soot bonded to damp limestone and stayed. The only surviving paperwork from a Confederate gunpowder operation in that cave is a number scorched onto a rock by somebody's candle. The cave runs daily tours now at a constant 58 degrees and later hosted moonshine stills and a mushroom farm. Somebody wanted to be counted, it worked. Number 29. The bone tools from 30 feet down. The bottom of the hole. In 1953, at Russell Cave in northeastern Alabama, archaeologists dug about 6 feet into the floor and hit pottery fragments, bone tools, and jewelry. Then, National Geographic and the Smithsonian arrived. Between 1956 and 1958, they went down more than 30 feet. The Park Service ran a final dig in 1962. The material runs from Paleo-Indian spear tips through archaic, woodland, and Mississippian layers. Each layer held only a handful of objects, which points to small groups, 30 people or fewer, coming and going for 100 centuries. Here's the part that lands. The oldest tools sat more than 30 feet below the floor. People were standing on in 1956. 100 centuries of dropped rubbish had physically raised the ground by the height of a 3-story building. The museum on site displays the pots, the points, the needles. It is somebody's ordinary Tuesday, stacked 400 deep. Number 28. The council room assemblage. A mile in the dark to hold a meeting. The entrance to Craighead Caverns is a small opening on the side of a mountain that gives nothing away. Inside, the passage expands into a series of enormous rooms. Roughly 1 mile from that opening is a chamber now called the council room. It has yielded pottery, arrowheads, weapons, and jewelry attributed to Cherokee use. The caverns take their name from Chief Craighead, a former owner. The site sits about 25 miles from Chota, the historic Cherokee capital. Entrance zone use is what you would expect from people looking for shelter. A deliberate mile-deep chamber is a different decision, beyond earshot, beyond daylight, beyond casual approach. They walked a mile into total darkness by torchlight to have a conversation and then walked a mile back. Whatever was said in there, they wanted the mountain between themselves and everyone else. Number 27. The gourd fragments. Someone brought a bowl. Among the objects recovered from Big Bone Cave in Van Buren County, Tennessee, pieces of a gourd, container, Somebody carried a bowl a long way underground 3,000 years ago and dropped it. Every other early woodland site in the region hands archaeologists stone and bone, because stone and bone are what survive outdoors. Big Bone Cave hands them the soft things. The perishable assemblage from that floor includes cane torches, woven moccasins, a woven fiber bag, and a fishing net. The formal study ran from August 1984 to August 1985. The reason we know what these people carried their food in is that they happened to break it somewhere the air was too dry for rot. The cave is gated now. No tours, no public access, no exceptions. A broken bowl outlasted every empire that came after it. Number 26. The 24 Burials, Infant to 50. Russell Cave was habitable by accident. A stream once ran across the entire floor. Then, the ceiling collapsed, shoving the water to one side and lifting the other side above the waterline. That produced a dry, level room that never moves off 58 degrees, and people used it on and off for 10,000 years. 24 of them were buried in that floor. The range runs from infants to one woman who lived to almost 50. That range matters. It tells you this was not a hunting party of young men passing through. It was families returning, generation after generation, sleeping directly above their own ancestors. The earliest pottery from the site is a little over 2,000 years old. The bow and arrow came after. Trade goods show a network reaching hundreds of miles. The oldest person recovered was that woman of almost 50, in a population where reaching 50 put you decades past most of the people you grew up with. After the excavations, engineers drove 15-foot bolts into the ceiling to stop it falling again. They made the roof safe about 9,000 years too late. Number 25. The candle smoke signatures. Both armies rode on the same wall. The Cumberland Gap is the notch in the Appalachian Wall, where Virginia, Tennessee, and Kentucky meet. Beneath it sits Gap Cave, 18.5 miles of surveyed passage, 6 known entrances, the 42nd longest cave in the United States. It was named in 1750 by Dr. Thomas Walker, who had been guardian to the young Thomas Jefferson after Jefferson's father died. The Gap changed hands repeatedly during the Civil War, and every occupying force sent men underground for niter, for shelter, for storage, out of boredom. A candle was standard issue, and thousands of men independently worked out that holding the flame to the ceiling and dragging it leaves a black line. Union and Confederate soldiers both wrote their names in that cave. Both sets are still legible, in the same passage, in the same medium, and you cannot tell from the soot which side wrote what. The cave Thomas Jefferson's own guardian, named in 1750, was, a century later, being scrawled on by both armies of the war that nearly ended Jefferson's country. The Park Service has guided tours through it since 1992. 2 armies, 1 wall, identical handwriting. Number 24. The abandoned vats, tramways, and ladders. Clocked out in 1865. Big Bone Cave sits in an outlier of the Cumberland Plateau, in deep hardwood forest and steep hollows. The National Speleological Society calls it America's largest underground saltpeter mine. The scale is the story. Up to 300 men at a time underground, dragging sacks of nitrous earth out to leaching vats near the entrance. An entire industrial workforce inside a hole in the ground, invisible from the surface. The operation ran from 1810 to 1815 and again through the Civil War. Then it stopped. Nobody demolishes infrastructure in a cave. There is no reason to and no profit in it. So the whole plant stayed exactly as the last shift left it, and the same dry air that made the niter form preserved the timber for 160 years. Tennessee's State Natural Areas program calls these the best preserved saltpeter mining artifacts in the state. It was the largest underground saltpeter mine in America, and it was abandoned so completely that the ladders are still leaning where the last man put them. The site is securely gated, no public tours, a factory nobody bothered to close. Number 23. The Ice Age fauna of Organ Cave, Reindeer in West Virginia. Greenbrier County is limestone belt country, rolling farmland, sinkholes, a 100-foot cliff where a stream simply sinks out of sight. Organ Cave runs over 40 miles of surveyed passage beneath it. The second longest cave in the state, a national natural landmark with more than 200 unexplored leads still open. The fossils recovered from it include grizzly bear, saber-toothed cat, giant ground sloth, Ice Age porcupine, and reindeer. That last one is the detail that stops people. Greenbrier County is temperate hardwood country. Caribou moving through it is the fastest way to understand how far the climate has swung since. Caves collect this evidence because animals fall in, or wash in, or die in them, and then nothing disturbs the bones. A limestone cave is an accidental museum with excellent climate control and no curator. The same cave that stored Confederate gunpowder chemicals also held the bones of animals that walked out of the last ice age. It runs tours and fossil hunts today by reservation from November through April. The mountain kept better records than anybody living on it. Number 22. The Peccary Molars. 750,000. Outside Cumberland, Maryland, on the western slope of Wills Mountain, there was a cave. Most of it is gone now. What is left of it is a stain in the wall of a railway cut you can cycle past on the Great Allegheny Passage. 2 teeth came out of that deposit. Peccary molars, dated by electron spin resonance to 722,000 years and 790,000 years. That technique was necessary because carbon dating stops working long before you reach 700,000 years. It reads accumulated radiation damage in tooth enamel instead. And those 2 molars became the anchor for the entire site. Everything else in the deposit is now understood in relation to them. The Cumberland Bone Cave local fauna is the most significant Irvingtonian vertebrate fauna in the eastern United States, north of Florida. 154 component taxa, 109 vertebrates, 28 of them extinct, 11 expeditions from 5 institutions across 79 years. These animals died before our species existed. Nobody was ever coming to find them. The railroad simply blew the hillside open. 500,000 years of nothing ended by a construction schedule. Number 21. The 20 holotype specimens. 20 species that start here. A holotype is the physical object that defines a species. It is the reference standard every later identification in the world gets measured against. If you want to know what a species is, you go and look at that one specimen. 20 of them came out of Cumberland Bone Cave. Excavation began the same year as the 1912 discovery, led by Smithsonian paleontologist James W. Gidley, who published a preliminary report in the Proceedings of the United States National Museum in 1913. Gidley died in 1931. Charles Gazin finished the work. Of the 109 vertebrate taxa recorded, about 26% are extinct. 20 holotypes from one collapsed cave is an extraordinary concentration, and it happened partly by accident of timing. The deposit opened in 1912. At the exact moment American vertebrate paleontology had the institutional capacity to respond properly. 20 years earlier, the bones go into the spoil heap. A local naturalist named Raymond Armbruster spotted bones and rubble being carted away from a railway cut and made a phone call. 20 species owe their scientific existence to that. One man paying attention on the right afternoon. Number 20. The saber-toothed cat skeleton, on permanent display from a hole in a railway cut. There is a saber-toothed cat mounted in the Ice Age mammal exhibit at the National Museum of Natural History in Washington. Thousands of people walk past it every week. It came out of a Maryland hillside that a railway crew accidentally blew apart. Between 1912 and 1916, the remains of over 40 species of mammal were recovered from that cut. 28 of them thought to be extinct Gidley recorded 41 genera, with numerous excellent skulls and enough bone to reconstruct complete skeletons for several species. The Smithsonian's 5-year study followed directly on the accident. The Western Maryland Railroad had begun cutting through the ridge in 1910, destroying a significant portion of the cave in the process. Much of the paleontological work that followed was, in the words of the Smithsonian's own recent volume, a salvage operation. Scientists picking through rubble a construction crew had already blasted. That so many complete skeletons emerged from a wrecked site is the surprising part. Almost nobody looking at that cat in Washington knows it was recovered from the debris of a railway construction accident in Western Maryland. The label does not mention the dynamite. Number 19, the Cumberland Cave Bear, named for the town that destroyed it. The bear is named after Cumberland, Maryland. Cumberland, Maryland is the town whose railroad blew apart the cave the bear was buried in. Very little is known with certainty about how that cave was originally discovered or explored, because the thing that revealed it also wrecked it. The cave had formed in the vertical plains of the Kaiser Limestone at an elevation of 840 feet, and beginning in 1910, the railroad cut straight through it. The bear survived on luck. A section of the deposit came out intact enough in the spoil for someone to notice, and the someone happened to be able to tell a fossil from a rock. Armbruster saw the bones among rubble being carted away and notified the Smithsonian. Had he been working elsewhere that week, the entire fauna would have gone into railway ballast. One local man looking at a rubble pile is the reason any of this exists. He was not an archaeologist, a geologist, or a railway employee. Just a naturalist who happened to be watching. The skeleton is in Washington. The cave is a mark on a wall beside a bike path. It got a name and lost a home in the same week. Number 18. The jaguar bones and the plaster footprints. And the cat that never found the door. In 1939, 2 off-duty cave guides at Craighead Caverns, named Jack Kiker and Clarence Hicks, went poking around the lower passages on their own time. Tourists never went down there, neither did anybody else. They found fossilized bones. The bones went to the American Museum of Natural History in New York, where they were identified as a very large jaguar and an elk fawn. That report pulled George Gaylord Simpson, one of the 20th century's most important vertebrate paleontologists, into a Tennessee hillside. He visited in May 1940, recovered more bone, and did the thing that mattered most. He made plaster casts of jaguar footprints preserved in the mud floor. He published in American Museum Novitates in August 1941 with photographs of both. He assigned the remains to Panthera onca augusta, and at the time they were among the best-known specimens of that subspecies. The cave's dry, undisturbed mud had held a 20,000-year-old trackway that a single careless boot would have erased. You can stand at the visitor center and look at casts of the actual footsteps of an animal that died lost in the dark 20,000 years ago, while the real bones sit in a drawer in Manhattan. 2 board employees changed what we know about a species. Number 17. The 37 loaded hoppers. The wooden boxes nobody emptied. In the hopper room of Organ Cave, West Virginia, 37 wooden leaching boxes stand in rows. All 37 still have the original dirt inside them. It is the largest surviving collection of Civil War saltpeter hoppers in the United States out of 52 originally built. Here's the wild part. Gunpowder needs saltpeter. Saltpeter comes from nitrate-rich cave earth. In 1861, the Union Navy closed the southern ports, and that arithmetic sent Confederate soldiers underground with shovels. The Confederacy mined 22 caves in what is now West Virginia between 1862 and 1865, and men were detailed to Organ Cave from 1861. The work was brutal and stupid in equal measure. Filling one hopper took an estimated 2,000 pounds of soil carried in 14 to 16 trips. Saltpeter had been mined there since the 18th century, through the War of 1812, and the soldiers simply took over the operation. They lived in the cave through the winters because the winters outside were worse. They held religious services in the chapel room. Robert E. Lee's men held church services in a chamber of that cave, and the path they cut down to it is the one tourists walk today. When the war ended, nobody was assigned to tidy up a hole in the ground in Greenbrier County. The hoppers stayed loaded. The dry air preserved the wood. 160 years later, somebody's shift is still not finished. Number 16. The fishing net and the woven fiber bag. Textiles that should not exist. A fishing net came out of Big Bone Cave. Nets are made of plant fiber. Plant fiber does not survive 3,000 years anywhere on the open surface of the earth. A woven fiber bag came out of the same floor. Almost everything we think we know about prehistoric Eastern North America is inferred from stone, because stone is what lasts. Textiles are the single largest blind spot in the record. An entire technology of nets, bags, cordage, mats, and clothing that we know existed and almost never get to see. The net is not more important than a projectile point. It is more informative because it is the class of object archaeologists normally have to guess at. The moccasins found alongside it were made from bark silk, the inner fiber of tree bark spun and woven by people we usually only meet through their chipped rocks. The survey that recovered it found early woodland activity to be the most intense period of prehistoric use in the cave. The cave stays gated and the work continues. For once, we are not looking at what these people threw away. We are looking at what they made. Number 15. The woven moccasins. Somebody's worn out shoes. Among the objects recovered from Big Bone Cave, footwear, woven, worn, discarded. Discarded footwear is one of the most human categories of object in archaeology. It means somebody's shoes gave out in the dark a long way from the entrance, and they took them off and left them there. It also means the trips were long and hard enough to destroy footwear. Nobody wears out a shoe on a short walk. The cave holds roughly 9.5 miles of surveyed passage and is a National Natural Landmark on the National Register of Historic Places. Native people mined it from minerals for over 2,500 years before any European ever leached niter out of it. Cane torches from the same floors carry radiocarbon dates from 1050 BC to AD 355. These are not ceremonial objects. They're not grave goods. They're somebody's rubbish, and that is exactly why they are valuable. We know almost nothing about the person who wore them, except that they walked until the shoes gave up. Quick pause. We opened this video with the West Virginia cave that gave Thomas Jefferson his giant claws. Let us know in the comments whether that one surprised you. If you are enjoying the deep dive so far, a thumbs up genuinely helps more people find these stories. The last 10 get considerably stranger. Number 14. The River Cane Torches. 14 centuries of burnt sticks. The floor of Big Bone Cave is scattered with burnout torch stubs. Radiocarbon dates on them run from 1050 BC to AD 355. That is 1,400 years of people walking into the same darkness, longer than the Roman Empire lasted. A river cane torch is a disposable object with a hard time limit. Torches of this kind in the wider region burn for something like 30 to 60 minutes. That single fact governs everything about deep cave use. How far you could go, how many torches you had to carry, how long you could stay, how catastrophic a mistake with fire management would be. The stubs are a scatter of expired timers across a cave floor, and their distribution maps out exactly how far people were willing to push into the dark before turning around. Every torch stub on that floor represents somebody making a calculation about how much darkness they could afford. 1,400 years of people doing the same arithmetic and getting it right. Number 13. The Paleophysis. The most valuable rubbish in Tennessee. On the 13th of December 1981, a group of hobbyist cavers from the Clayton County Cavers Grotto were moving through Big Bone Cave and found something numerous, desiccated, and unmistakably human. 3,000-year-old feces. It is, without exaggeration, the most scientifically valuable material on that floor. Stone tools tell you what people made. Bones tell you what died nearby. Paleofeces tell you what a specific individual actually ate, and when, and in what combination, down to seeds, parasites, and plant species. It is the closest thing archaeology has to a direct interview. A cave dry enough to preserve them in quantity is a rare piece of scientific luck. A grotto of hobbyist cavers found it, and a full University of Tennessee archaeological survey followed within 3 years, running from August 1984 to August 1985 under George Crothers. Archaeological work in the cave continues to this day. The oldest, most personal record we have of these people is the one they would have been most embarrassed to leave. Number 12. The only ground sloth with a complete pelvis. One of one. In 1811, saltpeter miners in Big Bone Cave hit bones that stopped the work. What came out was a giant ground sloth, Megalonyx jeffersonii, an animal 9 feet long. The cave is named for it. Then things went badly. The bones were not excavated. They were sold, split, and scattered. Part of the skeleton went out with the niter to a Mr. Clifford in Lexington, Kentucky, who bought most of the saltpeter. Another part went to Squire Moses Fisk of Hillam, who broke it up further as gifts. A claw to Professor Benjamin Barton in Philadelphia. The remainder to Gerard Troost, the state geologist of Tennessee. Clifford's share passed to Dorfeuille of the Cincinnati Museum, then to J. Price Wetherill, then finally to the Academy of Natural Sciences, where Richard Harlan, the first real vertebrate paleontologist in America, described and figured it. 2 centuries later, across every giant ground sloth ever recovered anywhere on Earth, this is still the only one with an intact pelvis. And it reached Philadelphia by way of a gunpowder merchant. The cave also gave up a Pleistocene jaguar in 1971. It survived being treated as merchandise by 4 separate owners, and it is still the best one we have. Number 11. The flint knife from the groundhog hole. A man walking his dogs. In 1955, a Pennsylvania farmer named Albert Miller was out with his dogs when he noticed something odd in the dirt a groundhog had thrown out of its burrow. He reached in and pulled out a prehistoric flint knife. Then he waited 12 years. In 1967, he enlarged a badger hole at the same spot and found lithic flakes, shells, and animal bone. That convinced him, and he reported it to local archaeologists. 6 more years passed. In 1973, a University of Pittsburgh professor named James Adovazio drove out to the farm, was handed the original knife, and understood immediately what he was holding. He applied to the Meadowcroft Foundation, essentially Albert and his brother Delvin, for permission to dig. Excavation ran 12 seasons between 1973 and 1999 in a remote forested hollow of the western Pennsylvania Appalachians. A groundhog dug up the artifact that would go on to threaten the foundational theory of how humans reached the Americas. Miller was not an archaeologist and had no institutional route to report anything. He was a farmer who knew what he had. The site is open to the public now. Excavation faces preserved under a purpose-built shelter. 50 years of argument, and it started with a man who did not throw the rock away. Number 10. The Miller Lancelate Point and the Miller Complex. The tools that broke the rule. Here's the thing about the layer. Adovazio reached at the bottom of that hollow. Stratum Tia produced 50 complete tools, or fragments, large enough to be recognizable implements. A Miller Lancelate type specimen made of local Cross Creek chert. Prismatic blade flakes. Points with straight bases and lance-like tips, largely smooth on the sides, rather than fluted like Clovis points. His team took more than 50 radiocarbon dates, primarily from hearth charcoal. The ages came back between 14, and 16,000 years. That was a problem. Clovis first was not a casual assumption. It was the organizing framework of North American archaeology, and it put the earliest people in the Americas around 13,000 years ago. A young professor with dates from a Pennsylvania farm was proposing to dismantle it. The attacks were technical and relentless. Contamination by lignite or coal, the absence of Pleistocene animal bone. Some of the criticism was fair. Adovazio's answer was volume and order. 50-plus dates in absolute stratigraphic sequence from one deeply stratified deposit. A later micromorphological study of the sediments found no evidence of groundwater contamination in the early levels and largely confirmed the original interpretation. The site also holds the longest sequence of continuous human occupation known in North America. Poll a room of archaeologists on how old this site is, and you get an almost perfect three-way split. 38% yes, 38% unsure, 20% no. Half a century of digging, and the field still cannot agree on what it is looking at. Number 9. The Winged Humans and the Chunky Player. The wall that shouldn't have existed. Until around 1980, the textbooks were clear. There was no such thing as ancient cave art in the dark zones of North America. Rock art outside caves, yes, recorded since Europeans arrived. Artwork a kilometer underground, no. Then a group of recreational cavers went into a narrow, wet stream passage south of Knoxville. They came up a slippery mud slope, through a tight keyhole in the cave wall, waded the stream itself, ducked a second keyhole, and climbed more mud into a high, dry passage well beyond the reach of any daylight. The walls around them were covered in figures traced into old mud banks, animals, warriors, winged humans. Transformational figures blending human with bird and snake with mammal. One is a human with a raised right hand, holding a chunky game piece in the left. These are emblems of the Southeastern Ceremonial Complex. They brought in Charles Faulkner of the University of Tennessee, who named the site Mud Glyph Cave and established the art as Mississippian, roughly 800 years old. The marks go well beyond drawing. There is evidence of kicking, cutting, hitting, raking, incising, smoothing, modeling, and possible preparation of the surface itself. To photograph a wall nobody knew existed, one man burned through more than 500 light bulbs, taking a shot every single meter on both sides. On film. The reason nobody had found it is that nobody had looked. Archaeologists dug sites. They did not crawl a kilometer through a stream on the chance that a mud bank might be decorated. 92 dark zone cave art sites have now been cataloged across 6 states. All of them because some hobbyists recognized that scratches in mud were not vandalism. Number 8. The torch lodged inside a drawing. The artist's own timestamp. Dating ancient art is normally close to impossible. You can date a hearth on the floor, proving the hearth and the drawing are the same. A vent is the hard part, and usually you cannot. In Mud Cliff Cave, a single stalk of burnt river cane was found jammed into one of the drawings. Not near it. Into it? Cane can only get into a mud surface while that surface is still soft. Which is to say, while the artist was working. It is a piece of the artist's own equipment, fossilized into their own picture. The survey team found hearths and torch evidence across the floor, dated the material, and used that embedded fragment to fix the site explicitly to between 1200 and 1350 AD. They mapped the cave twice. Once in its entirety, once focusing only on the glyph passages, and searched the floor for discarded artifacts. The one thing archaeologists almost never get from ancient art is the moment it was made. Here, it was handed over by a broken torch that somebody pressed into wet mud 800 years ago and never picked back up. The site remains protected and closed. The location is not published, because the glyphs sit on unstable mud and a single touch can destroy them. Somebody dropped their light and it turned into the most precise clock in the room. The scapula fragments that solved a 200-year mystery, 2 pieces of shoulder blade. For most of the 20th century, nobody could say for certain which West Virginia cave had produced Thomas Jefferson's famous bones. The credit went to Organ Cave in Greenbrier County on the strength of a story popularized in the 1920 seconds by a local man from Marlinton named Andrew Price. The story held for 70 years. Then, in 1993, 2 fragments of a megalonic scapula turned up in Haynes Cave in neighboring Monroe County. Smithsonian paleontologist Frederick Grady presented the evidence in 1995. While he owned the cave, he found additional megalonyx bone, plus numerous small rodent fossils that revealed a great deal about Ice Age climates and species distributions. The decisive piece of evidence was a spelling mistake. Jefferson had recorded the cave owner as Frederick Crower. Property records show he meant Frederick Gromer, who owned Haynes Cave and never owned Organ Cave. Jefferson's correspondence also put the cave about 5 miles from Colonel Stewart's home, with saltpeter vats inside. At the time of the original find, the cave would have been in Greenbrier County anyway. Monroe County was formed later. The county line moved, not the cave. Organ Cave still tells the Jefferson story to its own paying visitors. The scholarly record has said otherwise since 1995. A misheard surname hid the birthplace of American paleontology for 2 centuries. Number 6. The sloth leg bone used to prop up a saltpeter vat. Scrap timber. The men who found the most famous fossil in American history used one of its leg bones as a stick to hold up a leaching vat. That bone was never recovered. It wore out and it was thrown away. Saltpeter mining required vats. Vats required props. The cave floor was full of long, rigid objects. To a crew working by candlelight against a commercial deadline, a fossilized femur is a piece of wood-shaped junk that happens to be the right length. There is no villain in this. Nobody in 1796 had a category for what they were holding. Cave deposits across Virginia, West Virginia, and Kentucky were yielding bones of animals no longer seen anywhere on Earth, and the discoveries were not being made by explorers or scientists. They were being made by miners digging niter out of cave floors. One writer on the subject put it plainly: you can only imagine the fate of the many more bones tossed away or lost to the curious and the careless. Both Jefferson and Colonel Stewart desperately wanted the skull, because the teeth would settle whether the animal was a carnivore or a herbivore. It never turned up. Jefferson restricted the name to Great Claw until further discovery, because the claw was the most distinguishing feature that survived. The single most consequential thing that ever happened at that cave, the birth of vertebrate paleontology in the United States, happened 1 year too late to save the leg bone. The workings are still there. The bone is not. Number 5. The evidence that was shoveled out. Here's the detail that stops people cold. The single most important artifact from Big Bone Cave is the one nobody can show you. 2 industries wanted the same dirt for opposite reasons. Early woodland people mined that cave for minerals for over 2,500 years, left an organic record in the sediment that has almost no equal in eastern North America. Torches, moccasins, a net, a bag, a gourd, paleophyses, the soft, ordinary, perishable evidence of actual lives. Then, starting in 1810, saltpeter crews came for the nitrate content of that exact sediment. Up to 300 men at a time, dragging sacks of nitrous earth out of the depths to leaching vats near the entrance. The published archaeological survey states it explicitly. Mining intensified during the War of 1812 and again during the Civil War, and it severely impacted the preservation of prehistoric remains. Everything modern archaeologists recovered from that cave is a remainder, the fraction the miners happened not to reach. The gunpowder that armed a war was leached out of 3,000 years of Native American archaeology, one 2,000-pound sack at a time. The cave is simultaneously the best preserved organic archaeological site in the region and a documented catastrophe, and both of those statements come from the same report. The vats are still standing at the entrance. The machine that consumed the record is the best preserved thing in the building. We will never know the size of what we lost, only that it was burned. Number 4. The 1828 stickball panel. In their month April. On the 30th of April, 1828, a Cherokee stickball team walked into Manitou Cave on the flank of Lookout Mountain in northeastern Alabama. They carried river cane torches. They kept walking for nearly a mile past the flowstone into a damp, remote chamber where a spring came out of the ground. Then they wrote on the wall. The inscription, in characters averaging about 80 millimeters tall, translates as, "Leaders of the stickball team on the 30th day in their month, April 1828. Nearby is another line. "We who are those that have blood come out of their nose and mouth." Stickball is not a game in the way that word usually lands. Its indigenous name translates roughly as the little brother of war. It is a ceremonial event running over days. The town they walked out of was Willstown, now Fort Payne. It was a major Cherokee political town, and it is where Sequoyah invented the syllabary. The writing they used was barely 3 years into formal adoption, and it had spread so fast that most of the nation was already literate in it. The dialect on that wall is Overhill Cherokee, from eastern Tennessee, Sequoyah's birth region. The date is in Arabic numerals, because Sequoyah did not propose new numbers. Outside, missionaries and settlers were pressing them to abandon exactly this kind of ceremony. The word "there" is the whole story. Writing, "In their month April," a Cherokee scribe drew a line between two calendars, two peoples, and two futures. 2 years later, Congress passed the Indian Removal Act. Fort Payne was established in 1830 as an internment post during removal. They recorded themselves in their own language, in a place nobody could overhear, in the last window they had. Number 3. Jefferson's Three-Claw Cores. The claws that fool the president. Monroe County, West Virginia. Narrow valleys, farm fields, low-wooded ridges, sinkholes. In the spring of 1796, workers mining saltpeter in a cave there unearthed bones that did not match anything. Colonel John Stuart packed some of them up and sent them to Thomas Jefferson, then Vice President of the United States. A femur fragment, an ulna, a radius. Foot bones including 3 large claws. On the 10th of March, 1797, Jefferson stood in front of the American Philosophical Society in Philadelphia and presented a paper on certain bones. He named the animal Megalonyx, giant claw. He argued it was a lion. And he took as his premise that the creature was still alive somewhere in the western wilderness. He had a reason to want that. The Comte de Buffon had argued that New World species were degenerate, smaller and weaker than Europe's. Jefferson took it as an insult to the country he was helping to build, and he wanted a monster. The claws obliged, except they were not claws at all. They were claw cores, the bone inside the claw. And when Caspar Wistar examined the same material, he identified a large, slow, leaf-eating ground sloth, which he named Megalonyx jeffersonii, in Jefferson's honor. A sitting vice president of the United States told the nation's leading scientific body that a giant lion was probably still alive in the West, on the strength of 3 claw cores dug out of a gunpowder mine. He was wrong in the most useful possible way. That paper is credited with founding vertebrate paleontology in the United States. The animal has been West Virginia's state fossil since 2008, and the last of them moved through those mountains about 11,000 years ago. The original bones are in Philadelphia. A replica sits in Morgantown. The cave is a locked gate on private land. He was hunting a lion, and he accidentally invented a science. Number 2. The 2.08-meter anthropomorph in regalia. The figures nobody could see. Somewhere in northern Alabama, on private land, There is a cave with an 80-foot wide mouth facing east. Walk in and the passage runs long and level. The ceiling comes down as you go. You cannot quite stand up. You do not have to crawl. There are big pools of standing water and the floor is uneven. The art starts while daylight is still just visible behind you. Hundreds of glyphs are incised into the natural mud coating, the ceiling across roughly 4,300 square feet. It is the richest known cave art site in southeastern North America. A caver named Alan Kressler found it in the 1990 seconds, and the first description was published in 1999. But the photographer, Steven Alvarez, could not shoot it. The space was too tight to compose an image. There was no way to get far enough back, so in 2017, the team returned and built a three-dimensional model of the ceiling from roughly 16,000 overlapping high-resolution photographs. When they finally stepped back, digitally, 5 figures appeared that nobody had ever seen. 4 human forms apparently in regalia, one of them carrying a rayed circle in the midsection, and a coiled snake, possibly a diamondback rattlesnake. They measure 0.93 meters, 1.81 meters, 2.08 meters. The largest is close to 11 feet. The ceiling is low enough that a person standing beneath a 2-meter figure sees maybe a forearm's length of it at a time. The whole image never resolves for a human eye. That was not an oversight. That was the condition the artist chose. Somewhere between roughly 1,000 and 1,900 years ago, crouching under a mud ceiling with river cane torches, tracing figures larger than themselves that nobody would ever take in whole. Archaeologists had been working in that exact chamber since the 1990 seconds, documenting hundreds of drawings, and never noticed the 11-foot figure directly above their heads. The location is withheld to prevent looting. The mud is so fragile, the lightest touch erases it. They made something enormous for an audience that was never going to be us. And number 1, the passage is wide. That is the first thing you notice. This is not a crawl or a squeeze. It is a walkable limestone corridor. The kind of place a Victorian tour guide could lead 40 people through without anybody ducking. Water comes out of the rock somewhere ahead and runs off into the dark. The air is cool and wet. Look up near the entrance, and the ceiling is covered in writing. Most of it is exactly what you would expect. Decades of English language, tourist graffiti, names and dates, left by visitors who paid for a ticket, and scattered through it in among all of that are characters in the Cherokee syllabary. Every single one of them is written backwards. In 2006, a historian and a photographer were in Manitou Cave in Fort Payne, Alabama, methodically documenting that English graffiti when they recognized what they were looking at. It took until 2019 for the translations to be published, in a study led by Bo Duke Carroll, a field archaeologist with the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians, Tribal Historic Preservation Office, and an EBCI tribal member. The reversal is not decoration, and it is not error. Jan Simek put it directly. The ceiling inscriptions are written backwards, as if addressing readers inside the rock itself. The Cherokee and the peoples before them understood caves as powerful places. Places where water emerged from the lower world, where the spiritual and the visible worlds sat close together, where the living could go in seclusion to find strength. If the cave is a doorway, then the audience for anything written there is standing on the far side of the wall, and the text has to be oriented for them. The cave also carries the signatures of Cherokee ceremonial leaders. One of them is Richard Guess, Sequoia's son, most likely a spiritual leader, beneath a line that reads, "I am a respectable man of authority." Government records place him in the area at exactly that time. Almost nothing else survives in there. The artifacts and stratified deposits were stripped out during the cave's years as a commercial tourist attraction. The writing is effectively the entire record. The messages on that ceiling are religious in nature. The researchers can read them. They chose not to print them because the Cherokee consider those words still sacred and still addressed to someone. That is the one artifact in this entire list where the mystery is being preserved on purpose. By 1828, the syllabary was 3 years old, and the nation was largely literate in it. 2 years after that, the Removal Act passed, and Fort Payne became a holding post for deportation. The messages stayed on the ceiling, aimed inward. Unread by anybody, they were not meant for. The cave sits on private land today, close to the public, and Cherokee scholars are still working through the writings in their homeland caves. Everything else on this list was a mystery, because we lost the answer. This one is a mystery because somebody is still keeping it, and they have every right to. There are dozens more of these. Caves in 6 states that have never been properly surveyed, and objects sitting in museum drawers with almost nothing written about them. My own favorite is the leg bone at number 6, because it is the perfect illustration of how close we came to knowing nothing at all. Which one surprised you most, and what did we miss? Subscribe if you want more of these.